war came knocking on Iran's door, everyone quickly looked toward its allies. For years, these so-called friends had been talking about strategic partnership, and most people were expecting Russia to make a move. But the response from the Kremlin was far from what Tehran had in mind. Instead of offering military support, Putin drew attention to the Russian technicians working at the nuclear plant in that city. Where are the friends you relied on now that war is at your doorstep? That's the kind of question being whispered again and again inside government buildings in Tehran. Just a few days ago, the country found itself thrown directly into a war. With Israeli airstrikes, American bombings, and attacks targeting its nuclear infrastructure, the conflict officially began. It turned into the biggest external threat in the country's history. But what stands out these days is how Iran has been left completely alone on the battlefield. Neither the Allied forces nor the strategic partners gave the support Iran needed. Especially the two major powers, Russia and China, either stayed silent or settled for cautious statements during this war. But Iran didn't just talk about friendship while Russia was at war. It sent thousands of kamikaze-style drones to Moscow for the Ukraine conflict. It also provided logistical and technical support, defying Western sanctions. So, when Russia was struggling on the front lines, Iran rushed to help. But now, the roles have switched, and Moscow has fallen into a deep silence. So what did China, aiming for global leadership, do? It didn't even send a hint of military support to Iran. For that reason, some voices rising in Tehran started to highlight the loneliness Iran is facing. The public realized that China and Russia's talk of friendship didn't really translate into support on the ground. There's growing frustration that the real priority in Tehran's relationships with these countries is economic gain. For example, comments like these were made on a program aired on Iranian state television. At the beginning of the year, Putin and Iran's President Pezeshkian met in the Kremlin and solidified their partnership against the US-led world order with a strategic agreement. But as tension peaked with recent airstrikes from Israel and the US, Tehran found itself vulnerable in the shadow of this partnership. A quick reminder, this channel analyzes political situations and offers different perspectives. The comments you leave here really help me understand your political views better. So please, make sure to share your thoughts on this topic. In a meeting with Iran's Foreign Minister Arakchi, Putin condemned Israel's attacks, but he didn't say a word about military support. Instead, he looked for a way out by saying, "Let's think together about how to get through this." In reality, these words showed that the military support Tehran hoped for had been replaced by mere diplomatic hopes. Meanwhile, things on the ground were tougher than they appeared. The Iranian government was facing a life-threatening crisis. Israeli airstrikes, American intervention, and Trump's calls for regime change had Tehran backed into a corner. During this process, Russia, one of Iran's most trusted allies, didn't provide any military support. This clearly shows that Iran didn't get the kind of solidarity it was expecting. Yet, they had stood together to support the Assad regime in Syria. Like I mentioned before, during the Ukraine war, Iran sent Russia ammunition and thousands of drones. But while Tehran was under heavy attacks, Moscow mostly just watched. Russia also warned that if the regime falls, or if Khamenei is assassinated, there would be serious consequences. In other words, this silence raises serious questions about how sustainable the current strategic partnership really is during a crisis. Nikolai Kushanov from Qatar University says Iran might ask Russia for support in retaliation against the US, but Moscow will never agree to that. And that's exactly what happened. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said back then that they had clear expectations from Russia based on their strategic agreement. But now, with Russia still fighting in Ukraine and facing Western sanctions, it has no intention of taking on the risk of war for Iran. Moreover, Russia wants to maintain its ups and downs with Israel and its ties with Trump. This attitude isn't new or surprising for Iran. After October 7th, Tehran announced orders for Su-35 fighter jets, Mi-28 attack helicopters, S-400 air defense systems, and training jets from Russia, but it only received about 130 training planes. Last year, Israel destroyed the Russian-made S-300 air defense systems Iran had. This paved the way for Israel to carry out airstrikes in Iran more freely in the near future. Despite months passing since the S-300s were hit, Russia hasn't sent any replacements. In their latest meeting, Arakchi asked Putin for support both for new air defense systems and rebuilding the nuclear energy infrastructure. So, what was Putin's response? He said Iran's interest in Russian weapons had decreased, and that Tehran hadn't made any new requests. This way, Tehran once again saw how distant its allies could be in a crisis. Iran was left alone when it needed Russia's help the most, but they're not the first ally the Kremlin has abandoned. When Bashar al-Assad was overthrown, Putin's only offer was asylum. During the opposition's fight against the Assad regime, Moscow deployed air defense systems to Syria, but at the same time, Russia turned a blind eye to Israel's attacks on Iranian militias inside Syria. Moreover, it didn't even fully activate those defense systems. Tehran stayed silent on this stance due to shared interests, but what was happening on the ground had already started to raise questions about Russia's position. Today, instead of providing military support, Russia is offering to calm things down. In fact, last week, Trump claimed Putin had offered to mediate and openly mocked him. For Iran, this lack of military aid signals a dark future. It means becoming even more isolated and increasingly dependent on Russia and China. There's a common criticism in Iran. Russia and China aren't true allies. They're using Iran's isolation to access cheap resources. The weapons they sell are either low quality or not delivered properly. On the other hand, the war's potential to raise oil prices works in Russia's favor, because a short to mid-term rise in oil prices gives Russia foreign currency and more room to maneuver. However, whether this profit will last depends on how strictly the West enforces the price cap, whether Iran can stay afloat, and if high prices will dampen demand. But Russia is still in the middle of a war. That needs to be kept in mind. For Moscow, every new weapon system sent to Iran means a resource taken away from the Ukraine front. The Russian army has ramped up its offensive in Ukraine since late spring and early summer. So, while Moscow has focused all its attention on the war in Ukraine for the past 3 years, it's reluctant to get directly involved in a conflict in the Middle East. Also, providing military aid to Iran could disrupt Moscow's delicate diplomatic balance with the US. The strategic partnership agreement signed between Iran and Russia doesn't force Moscow to give Tehran direct defense support. On the other hand, possibility of regime change in Iran is one of Russia's biggest threats. This goal is now openly stated by Israel as well. If this ever happens, and the new leadership has a worldview very different from the current one, Moscow will lose another key ally in the Middle East after the fall of the Assad regime. Moreover, this would be a significant loss not just regionally, but also strategically on a global scale. In a recent speech, Putin emphasized the need to respect both Iran's right to peaceful nuclear activities and Israel's unconditional security demands. In other words, Moscow is trying to balance the interests of both sides at the same time. So, where does China stand in all this? After Israel's attacks, eyes turned to Beijing, Iran's longtime friend, since one of its closest partners was being bombed. China didn't delay its response, at least verbally. Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke with his Iranian counterpart Arakchi right after the events. The main point made during the meeting was a clear condemnation of Israel's violation of Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. While China condemned the attacks, it stuck to familiar diplomatic phrases and didn't provide any concrete support. In fact, China aims to be a global power challenging the US. It wants to be a more influential player in world politics. It's trying to build an alternative world order while benefiting from the current system. Iran is an important player in this regard. It represents a strategic link for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Additionally, in 2023, it became a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization led by Russia and China. This year, Iran took part in joint military exercises with China and Russia during the Maritime Security Belt 2025 drills in the Gulf of Oman. Despite all this, they have refused to provide military support to Iran or get directly involved in the current situation. They're only using balanced statements aimed at calming Tehran, avoiding provoking the US, and not worsening relations with Israel. According to China expert Xu Blanket from the RAND think tank, Beijing lacks both the diplomatic capacity and the courage to manage such a rapidly escalating and volatile situation. That's why China prefers to remain a measured and cautious player. According to Zhu Feng, a professor of international relations at Nanjing University, China's main concern is economic stability. Any instability in the Middle East threatens China's trade and energy security. That's why the Iran-Israel conflict is a big risk for Beijing. When Iran's parliament proposed closing the Strait of Hormuz, China immediately opposed it. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun emphasized the need for international intervention. According to a 2024 report by the US Department of Energy, 80 to 90% of Iran's exported oil goes to China. That's about 1.2 million barrels. China heavily relies on this energy flow to sustain its industrial production. The oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, so China's footprint in the Middle East is commercial, not military. China's tendency to remain neutral in conflicts has so far been explained by its foreign policy prioritizing stability. The Beijing leadership has avoided hot conflicts and tried to manage global crises through dialogue whenever possible. However, possible conflict scenarios worldwide have started to question the sustainability of this approach, because if China gets drawn into a similar security crisis in the future, it seems inevitable that it will seek support from its allies. In conclusion, China and Russia with whom Iran has had strategic partnerships for years, were absent on the ground while Iran was being struck. This war reminded Iran of a harsh truth once again: loneliness. Although Russia and China may have followed a wait-and-see strategy, the attacks significantly set Iran back. However, it should be noted that while they haven't provided military support during the war, they have transferred both weapons and technology to Iran so far. According to a report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia has been the main arms supplier to Iran over the past decade. Additionally, recent news indicates that Iran ordered thousands of tons of missile fuel from China. The material is ammonium perchlorate. It's one of the most critical components used in solid-fuel ballistic missiles. The amount Iran is set to receive is enough to fuel hundreds of short-range missiles. On the other hand, Israel's ally America fully backed it on TV. Washington is showing other countries in the region that the cost of confronting the US is very high. Actually, we shouldn't put all the blame on Russia and China. There's also Iran's side to the story. Its long focus on nuclear issues isolated it internationally. As a result, the country fell short in building a collective security architecture. At the same time, they made significant investments in ballistic missiles and drones. However, they neglected their air forces. The locally developed aircraft were more of a showcase. The reason for investing in ballistic missiles was mainly because these missiles are harder to stop compared to warplanes. They avoided the risk of reaching Israel with aircraft because the chances of actually getting there were low. In other words, Iran's recent crisis reopened the debate on how effective its strategic partnerships are on the ground. While Russia and China prioritized diplomatic rhetoric and economic interests over military engagement, Iran was left alone on the ground. What's happening may lead Iran to reconsider its security architecture and foreign policy strategy. When war knocked on Iran's door, all eyes turned to its allies. Friends who had long emphasized strategic partnerships, especially Russia, were expected to step up. But the response from the Kremlin fell short of Tehran's expectations. We'll watch the developments together from here on. To stay updated on these analyses, make sure to subscribe and leave your comments. They're very important for the growth of the video and the channel. Thank you all.